made it plain enough that British armed forces could wipe the Irish nation out of existence. No one but a madman would question it. And in that sense, then, there was, during the negotiations, as there has always been, as between England and Ireland, the element of duress present. Nobody doubts that had we been able to do it, we should have beaten the English out of Ireland, as our simple right. Had we been able to do it, we should have whipped England decisively, and then the treaty negotiations would have been conducted in Dublin, and we should have been a conqueror nation announcing terms of surrender to a vanquished foe. The only reason that did not happen was because we could not make it happen. What good end is to be served by pretending otherwise?
I have to communicate with Sir James Craig tonight. Here are the alternative letters which I have prepared. One enclosing the articles of agreement reached by His Majesty's government and yourselves, and the other saying that the Sinn Féin representatives refused the oath of allegiance and refused to come within the Empire. If I send this letter, it is war, and war within 3 days. Which letter am I to send?
Seo scéal trí lá I mína nolach. Sa seachtú dóhfuir a chlic seo, tarlóid srá achtraí a aros stair na héireann go brach. Seolú cúgur fearr chun dul margaíocht is na Sasannaí, agus inis tá an scéal ag crábh na Hilinne. Brahan tauchaí an náisiún festa Arto Grífa, Víhalló Cuileáin, Robert Barton, George Gavin Duffy agus Éamon Duggan. De réir mar a dionan siad sa sacrú an lá fuór gíomhrí seo a London, ascróí coga nó síchán, mair a dtíine, cáilsfar dtíine. Síníam an sas coga a chur deireadh le coga na Saoirse an taobhú lá déag de úl sem líon 1921. Chur sé deireadh le gábh líon trealchagaíochta a gcoinne na Sassanach. Gábh líana dag bailte agus carachas Christa agus na céta duine cáilte. A thug seach an cín an tas aontas faoi hala a bhí go láidir I measc príomh phobal na glúisteachta náisiúnta in éireann. Tháinig aontas feasanta sa darathait nar bhí coga le treid a gcoinne an nábhaid chaitianta. A chalua sa tháinig sos leis an goga in na Sasanach, ní fada go ra síalta cahanna fuilteacha eile a péco. Go lua tar éis an tasa cogaí, thosa an idir bheartaíocht chonra. Is cuin le ní O'Malley slúite na néireann go London bailí na sráideanna chun raich go áilir na fir go ra tauchaigh na héireann inis a bra arú.
Lá miúil ceir a bhíohin, tugadh faoi dear seanna bhean éireannach go raibh seáil ar a fuileáil timpeall ar chuir T. Lloyd George is rá Downing. Thug Lloyd George féin bhí dearí agus tháinig sé go dtí an doras, dosca lé agus glí sé orthaí, chatar wit a ddíomhí an príomhheara, an féad le mé ní a dhéanamh duit. Is féidir a dúirtí, bí aslam an siomra eiscint ina míonmhar grunithe agah. Thug sé leis isteachí agus heispáin sé an siomra crunithe dí. Chasín tusa ar siise, chuir sé lábhar chathíir agus meanga ar a bhéal. Thug sí mhaith. Chasí an túachtarán de bhaléire nuair thuca sé. Heispáin sé caithíir eile dhí. Chuirdigh sí brolach a gúna agus thug sí budéal beag go raibh corca an amach. Thug sí amach an corca agus chris sí cuid dá raibh sa budéal lena méranta ar an gathíir agus ar an urlóir fin na bun. An sin chosric sí féin. Sin isce cosrice don uachtarán ar siise. Gus teorí dí é nuair a híonn sé an sa chun éire a héire. Shiúil sí a dro na caithíireach Lloyd George féin. Chris sí go flúirseach air. Bhí aoine ar dús ar an bríomhheara a chuine sé meanga arís chun an tethe a chur ar an deabhail é sin a dúirt sí, agus chuir sí an corc sa budéal agus chur arás ina brulach é.
De Valera would not head the delegation that went to London. Every member of the cabinet and every Choctaw of Dáil Éireann wanted him to conduct the treaty negotiations, and many of us pleaded with him not to remain behind, but he was immovable. The reason he gave us was twofold. First, he said it was beneath his dignity as President of the Irish Republic to leave his country. And second, he could not afford to put himself in a position in which he might do his nation irreparable harm by a chance word across the conference table. He insisted his value to the Irish people would be greatest by remaining in Dublin, and from that distance, guiding us in our task.
Nuair a dúirt Valera nach raibh sé héana gáil ann, bhí is ann a dúirt gur chosú leis seo leis an imreoide beár bhí agat a ágáil ag baile. Thug an chéad ghrúpa faoi London I mí ar a fúbhail. Bhí loch na lán chuachta ar fad in na measc a bháin an Coilánach, agus thugad ar lá fearan omlán tacaíochta. Bhí an éireann idir bheartaíochta rannaí go cuaramach ag de Valera chun grúpaí éagsúla laiste den chomhaontas sin féin a hasú. Bhí artó grífa an mar ionadaí ar an gur chuige bunreachtúil. De bhaintear de Valera héin a bheith Robert Barton agus George Gavin Duffy. Rannaí Éamon Duggan as a haneolalas dlí. An teachta dearnach a tháinig Michael Collins, bhí sé an ar son an Adam agus bhráide chuis fablocht na héireann. Ba léir ó hús nach ra poblocht nó éireannach hua agus heas I gceist ar éon chuntas ó híomh na Sasanach de. Cór de cheanál éigean lasdé den impideacht, sinne is mó go bhéadfaí a aimsiú. De bhíú an práis sinne íc, da dúrach sé an críche éire éontaithe. A chuige sin has doch éontas an bhóide fratastónaí sa tuaisceart, agus go háirithe éontas phríomh ar an lú uisceart na héireann Sir James Craig.
It now merely remains for de Valera and the British people to come to terms regarding the area outside of that which I am Prime Minister.
Collins said that for us to agree to any conditions defining the future relations of Great Britain and Ireland prior to Craig's giving his assent to the unity of Ireland was impossible. That to do so would be to surrender our whole fighting position. That every document we ever sent them had stated that any proposals for the association of Ireland with the British Commonwealth of Nations was conditional upon the unity of Ireland. That unless Craig accepted inclusion under the All-Ireland Parliament, the unity of Ireland was not assured, and that if he refused inclusion, we should be left in the position of having surrendered our position without even having secured the essential unity of Ireland.
Bhí dochas ag Lloyd George go ndeadach leis Tuairt ar Craig éon tú le Parliament ile éireann ach nuair a hepper sin chaise málacht stratéise a tharraingt chuige héin.
I'm offering to create an all-Ireland Parliament with Ulster to have the right to vote itself out within 12 months. And if it did, a boundary commission to be set up to delimit the area.
Bhí maileadóireacht in na córáití, bhí toscaireacht na héireann a dúilt tú géile ar cheist alla, agus bhí brú ar Lloyd George ón rialtas féin rudaí a chuairt chun críche. Faoi mar a dúirt Erskine Childers rúnaí generalta toscaireacht an na héireann, tháinig Lloyd George fear dramatúil ar réiteach dramatúil.
Lloyd George became agitated and accused the Irish of trying to use the Ulster question to break off talks when the real difficulty was the opposition in Dublin to membership of the British Commonwealth. Then dramatically, he turned to Griffith and accused him of going back on his promise not to repudiate the Boundary Commission proposal. Furthermore, the British Prime Minister produced the memorandum that Griffith had approved back in November. "What is this letter?" Barton whispered to Collins. "I don't know what the hell it is." "Do you mean to tell me, Mr. Collins, that you never learned of this document from Mr. Griffith?" Lloyd George asked. The document outlining the Boundary Commission proposal was passed across the table to Collins and Barton. Both saw it for the first time. Collins said nothing.
I have fulfilled my part of the bargain. I took the risk of breaking my party. You in Ireland often bring against us in England the charge of breach of faith. Now it is for you to show that Irishmen know how to keep faith.
I said I would not let you down on that, and I won't. I said provided we came to an agreement on other points, I would accept inclusion in the Empire on the basis of the Free State.
Do I understand, Mr. Griffith, that though everyone else refuses, you will nevertheless agree to sign?
Yes, that is so, Mr. Prime Minister.
That is not enough. If we sign, we shall sign as a delegation and stake the life of the government on our signature. Is the Irish delegation prepared to do the same?
Magur ceist alla jede a chur leis an idirvertaíocht I ddró is go na ascroch an cogo. Chur lai George Mollo faoi bhráid I grífa go mna faoi comisiún teoran chun suamhnas a chur James Craig agus na héintachtóirí. Agus nuair díar príomh na Bretagne an grífach gan chur a gcuine an Walta thug an teachta éireannach a acal.
Mr. Griffith said, speaking in his soft voice and with his modest manner, I will give the answer of the Irish delegation at 9 tonight. But, Mr. Prime Minister, I will personally sign this agreement and recommend it to my countrymen. Do I understand, Mr. Griffith, said Lloyd George, that though everyone else refuses, you will nevertheless agree to sign? That is so, Mr. Prime Minister, replied this quiet little man of great heart and great purpose. Michael Collins rose, looking as though he were going to shoot someone, preferably himself. In all my life, I never saw so much passion and suffering in restraint.
Irama sé yes agus véide sé an mélach ráma. Deire sé na hasa letir in scach lábhleis. Chuig Sir James Craig a bhíidir a réan seolta. Laur ceán an gunra agus an síchan agus an ceán eile chogga láireach fuilteach.
Whichever letter you choose travels by special train to Holyhead and by destroyer to Belfast. The train is waiting with steam up at Euston. Mr. Shakespeare is ready. If he is to reach Sir James Craig in time, we must have your answer by 10 p.m. tonight. You can have until then, but no longer to decide whether you will give peace or war to your country.
Everyone who heard the British Prime Minister believed beyond all reasonable doubt that this time he was not play-acting and meant all he said. I wonder if you realize the monstrous iniquity of that. The complaint is not that the alternative to signing a treaty was war. The complaint is that the alternative to our signing that particular treaty was immediate war. The position was this, that if we, every one of us, did not sign and undertake to recommend, fresh hordes of savages would be let loose upon this country to trample and torture and terrify it. And whether the Cabinet, Dáil Éireann, or the people of Ireland willed war or not, the iron heel would come down upon their heads with all the force which a last desperate effort at terrorism could impart to it.
Both Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith at this moment saw the shadow of doom clouding over that fateful paper, their own doom. Michael Collins was not appalled by the spectre of death, but he had the Irishman's fear of encountering that charge which comes so readily to the lips of the oppressed, that of having succumbed to alien will and betrayed their country. He asked for a few hours to consider, promising a reply by 9 o'clock.
The Cabinet had certainly told us that they were prepared to face a renewal of war, but a situation had now arisen which they had never visualized. Griffith had gone over to the English. In Dublin, he had declared that he would not break upon the question of the crown, and yet he was sent back as our leader. He'd been outmaneuvered, outwitted, and smashed, and he now proceeded to smash us.
Nine passed, but the Irish leaders did not return. 10, 11, and they were not yet back. We had doubt as to whether we should see them again.
Tá míid cúpla seachtain rivanolaigh sam líon 1951 agus tá tír na héireann scrista le cogal. Cremiú ceart agus cód, dlí agus riar le din chogal na sírse. Tá fuilech gunaíán agus fuilech fear guna, agus tá achran le réiteach. An nainiún an tasa coga, onsíomh trúpaí sasanacha agus an RIC. Díaltas áitiúil le bheith chuideachú, agus bhí a thuile ag gghearra onsíthe sasanacha a spreaga. Bhí breis is 100,000 fear dí oslíthe. thar le gadaíocht agus go bhfuil séalúchais peacu ar bhaile leis an boblocht nó le leas persanta é. Is an ggóhéic seo thocra artó grífa gur a dón fallanthe ag éirin. Bhí gealta aige go Lloyd George nach licach sé síosa ar bholacha misisiún na teorann, agus ba chuma cad éon costas persanta a éalóch sé seo chluíoch sé lena ocail. A dúidim ristead I bhfuil chatha ceann fórne an IRA ba chóra é seo ar fiar misisiúil.
The question arises to my mind as to whether these are not the most valiant words ever spoken in the course of Irish history. They were the words of a man who, in an unquenched gaiety of spirit, had suffered poverty and degradation and apparently fruitless labours for years, entirely devoted to the service of the uplift of the people in terms of spirit, economic well-being, social happiness, political strength. Griffith must have, by 5th of December, been fully aware of the dangers that were inherent in the inconsequential approach of persons like Stack and Brewer. And he must have been fully aware of the internal difficulties among the most important British members of the negotiating group. I cannot feel that in his most wearied, his most frustrated, his most disappointed moment, Griffith would yield to any element of despair, either personally or for the Irish people. But I feel that these words represent a supreme valour that in another might have to be called despair or recklessness.
Agus na socrthaithe London a teach go dtí a muachmhainte, bhí éman de bhaléire a líomnach ag cigireacht ar ranán iararach an Adam náisiúnta. Cha sé an líche I deach Patricia Lavelle.
He was there, staying with grandfather in Strand House. And with them, amongst others, were Dick Mulcahy and my cousin, Michael Rinn, who was the equerry. There was a guard of honour of 32 volunteers, and these were also lodged in Strand House, in the huge cavernous rooms of the basement. Must have been at least 100 years since such a number had occupied those dark flagged rooms. There were great meals prepared for the whole party.
Bhí fear tí na híche sin Stephen O'Mara and a heachta Parliament de Home Rule faoi Cheannas Parnell siar in sna 88
In the course of the evening, sitting round the fire, De Valera asked grandfather, "What did you really think of Parnell?" "I'll tell you what I thought of him," grandfather replied. "If I were crossing over Sarsfield Bridge and Parnell said to me, 'Jump into the river,' I would jump." And there they had it. The tremendous personal magnetism of a leader dead over a quarter of a century was brought before them. Upstairs, there was plenty of brisk conversation, but behind the talk, everyone's thoughts were with the delegates in London. News should come in at any time.
Bhí na tascaireachaí éireannacha a London tar éis fágand chun na macna bhíonna imachtaí na hiarmóna. Bhí ráfla I Cadogan Gardens gur a rud éigean duchleití le tarlú, rud a chur aine bhuiil fórne I choláin nós an rónaí Kathleen McKenna.
Bhí sé tar éis leithní a hocht nuair a chúla mé na cárna ag doras Gordini Cadogan. Rith Collins agus a hlua cinúnach fear sias an holla agus cosanáirde suas an staire. Saravad tháinig broi de ruúid a nuas an staire go dtí mifig. Dúirt sé go raibh Michael Collins Olive chun an conra a híú an ihe sin, agus gur cheartlam dul go dtí Hans Place, mar go raibh seans go mbeadh gálam an. Dúirt broi go dúchach sé in éanachlam. Higamar go raibh daoine ag fuileáil timpeall in san scá.
Seolú dréacht leasithe de Héarmún na Breataine chu ceann carúna an tascaireachta éireannaí a Hans Place timpeall an Lío Chlog. Ní fada in the Yeshin no gur tháinig Michael Collins.
Bhí ní aine bhaiceal ná raibh an chuid eile ribh sa hala. Shiúil sé sias agus suas seomra an bhí go nervhíseach. Chuir sé duine ag in áirde staire chun rá go raibh sé híos, ach níor chuaigh sé féin suas. In ionad sin, shiúil sé faoi mar bheith anmhí alta I gás. Sias agus suas, grúama, ciún, duisialach. An son, cha sé féin an nuas ar ná chaithir seomra bia. Agus méid féchant bhris mo chrí le brón, nuair a chuimh níos ar an géasa agne a bhí ag brú ar an bhfear seo. Higus go hamnán trimme na freagrachta a bhí búilte ag cún sí ná rah aon smacht ag orthú ar a rúile óga fiala.
A copy of the revised British draft terms was delivered to the Irish delegation's headquarters at Hans Place at 9 o'clock. Michael Collins arrived shortly afterwards. Griffith spoke almost passionately for signing.
Up to this moment, it had never occurred to us that Collins intended to follow the lead of Griffith, but we had hardly started talking when he declared that it was his intention to sign also, and Duggan, of course, followed suit. It was as if the world fell in pieces around us. All three then turned upon Duffy and me. Collins insisted that we knew nothing about the extremity the country was in, or the exhaustion of the volunteers. His brilliant system had been rendered helpless by elimination of its key men. He knew that physical resistance, if resumed, would collapse, and he was not going to be the leader of forlorn hope. He intended to live to fight again.
Duine inis agus duine ríis, bhí ó grífa an Colánach agus Duggan a tí síú an éimis na cuda eile a chur Bertan mail arú. Leanan aragóint go fada sin is gur an teóra ama a bhí lecaí síos ag Lloyd George ídíthe le breis is uair a chhlaig.
We had doubts as to whether we would see them again. If only Michael Collins has as much moral courage as he has physical courage, we shall get a settlement. But moral courage is a much higher quality than physical courage, and it is a quality that brave men often lack.
We had the most frightful battle in the delegation amongst ourselves, at which the most terrific things were said to Gavin Duffy and to me by Collins and Griffith and Duggan. 3 times they put on their hats and took their coats to go without us. "Barton," said Duggan, "you will be hanged from a lamppost in the streets of Dublin if your refusal to sign causes a new war in Ireland."
Bhí sinú Barton fiar hálachtach, bine fear de Valera, gan na hacaíocht siúd diet bhí éon tacrú a chealú. Tréis gáhaideach le Aragóna has a Barton a lagú.
My dilemma was that whilst I knew the Cabinet and Ireland would face war under united leadership, I had no idea what they would do when 3 of the principal leaders had ratted. I was acting in a public capacity, not a private one. When 3, including Collins, whom I had always looked upon as the pivot in our army, had agreed, what would the rest do when faced with war under divided leadership? Had I known Dev, Brewer and Stack better, I would not have signed it. What was perhaps the determining factor with me was that I had no idea whether, having refused to sign and thereby flung the country lads into war, I should not have been told when I returned that I had no justification for committing the country to war under divided leadership. This was an eventuality never dreamed of. Not one of us, not even Erskine Childers, thought of the instructions that had been given us before we left Dublin for the first time, that the final draft or the document about to be signed must be brought home for confirmation. If Duffy, Childers or I had stumbled upon that fact in our memories, we could have found justification for our refusal, and the articles of agreement would have had at most 3 signatures only, if any. Nobody thought of the instructions.
Bhí sé timpeall cearú tréis hí néag nuair chun na toscarí éireannacha ó Hans Place go Stráid Downing mar a Winston Churchill rúnaí stáit chogha a fannachló.
As before, they were superficially calm and very quiet. There was a long pause, or there seemed to be, and then Mr. Griffith said, "Mr. Prime Minister, the delegation is willing to sign the agreements, but there are a few points of drafting which perhaps would be convenient if I mention at once." Thus, by the easiest of gestures, he carried the whole matter into the region of detail, and everyone concentrated upon those points with overstrained interest so as to drive the main issue into the background forever.
Bhí de Valera agus a buin fós sitja caistinne is Strand House nar a bhfuilin telefón dearnach san liche. Bé Garrod O'Sullivan a bhír an bhóm agus scéala aige gur an conra sínithe. Bhí de Valera gur gheall an grífoch dal a gúrla leis an ggóireacht sal a sínoch sé éon dacaméid. Nar a thug am bhfuil chatha an gluach, iúlta de Valera teacht go dtí an telefón.
On Monday night in Limerick, I heard over the telephone that some agreement had been reached, and I felt like throwing my hat in the air. I felt certain, on account of Griffith's undertaking, that our proposals had been accepted.
Very early next morning, there was a telephone call for the visitors. Grandfather thought it might be news of the treaty at last, but nobody said anything. Grandfather drove to the station with de Valera. Nothing of any significance was said on the way. There was a reserved carriage on the train, and de Valera stepped into the main compartment of it. Michael Rinn was following him when Dick Mulcahy tapped him on the shoulder and indicated the end carriage, in which they then ensconced themselves. Nothing was said, but something had surely happened.
An train go blá clia, hí de Valera agus brú I leatíb ó bhfuil chatha agus Michael Rinn. Is minic I captar go an train sin a planalú an cogo cahaga.
A stop press was being cried along the streets. The treaty had been signed. They all knew it, and the very last to know was Grandfather. If he privately felt annoyed, publicly, he was the more greatly admired for the guard he could keep on his tongue.
Bhí an scéala mo, díreach agus na nuachtáinir tí ógurt gur a tepe I ríis ar na córátí, go haban bhí fógra stadiú leidena fí mar a dúirt Times London. The brief news of the agreement reached the Dublin newspapers about an hour before they went to press this morning. Nothing could be altered at that late hour, and only one newspaper, the Freeman's Journal, found time and space for a word of comment, expressing its confidence that the peace terms conformed to the principles for which Ireland stands. There is no visible excitement in Dublin today, and those who remember the public jubilations whenever the Nationalist Party scored a political point in the old times are struck by the contrast. The greatest incident in 700 years of Anglo-Irish history happened in the small hours of this morning. But this afternoon, not a single banner or illumination brightened the murky streets of Dublin.
Bhíoch na siopí go hálín, lásta súsaníthe, agus na fuinneog go lásta le gachin rud an nullag. Agus détá dul ag fécin dearthú, lánú ihe, tríú cethir máidín. Ó, bhí mis I mu fanna híthe. Héimi sé gcónaí go dtí cléirís chun fécin isteach I ngach fuinneog. Agus bhí siopin sin shráid talbóid, gainíos. Well, an fear leis an siopa sin, dearg sé leat dul sáil déanach ihe nullag, agus thorach sé guit na bregan a bhí fáca. Ó sure an sin bheith flád bheag agin an tráid, agus bhíimiis ag árán. Nead a rís ná go meach busca ceol ag duine éigen, agus beidir go rathamiis amach an tráid ag árán. Ó, bheag gach aine ag rinke an tráid am nullag.
Bhí an tuairim chéine ag Elizabeth Murphy agus a bhí ag Times London. The first thought which occurred to many was that the coming Christmas would be the happiest which Ireland has known not merely since 1913, but in the present generation. Emotion exhausted itself today, and the country waits quietly upon events. I am writing before the actual arrival in Dublin of the terms of the agreement. And in the meanwhile, the Dublin Mansion House appears to be without news. An níche sin is mó bhí teach an ardmhéar im lá clia gofa le fille idálach gan tríú ís déag. Bhí ihe léachtainna agus caidill ag ceiliúra cumóra 600 bliain báis dante siúl, agus Jill de Valera lá clia chun na bheith na chairlach an ócáid. Bhí an tardmhéara, Count Plunkett, Sir Thomas Esmond agus Avishteen de Stack in the Hanta.
He donned his gown and was about to lead the way into the round room when who should arrive but Mr. E.J. Duggan and Mr. Desmond Fitzgerald. Duggan reached the President an envelope which the President ignored. Duggan asked him to read the contents. "What should I read it for?" "Oh," said Duggan, "it is arranged that the thing be published in London and Dublin simultaneously at 8 o'clock, and it is near that hour now." "What?" said the President. "To be published whether I have seen it or not, whether I approve or not." "Oh, well, that's the arrangement," Duggan replied. The President took up the envelope, opened, glanced over the contents. At that moment, he appeared to me to be an almost broken man.
Bhí Piers Beasley teacht de dála chiarí a láirt ag Comóra Dante ar éon stáitse le De Valera.
Bhí me hí an acleis agus ba átram an brú agus an bhuthalacht a bhí chuirtine séid. Agus a linn ámas ar fad, níor an cunra erid is leit aige. Níor se curtit a rua ag ar hain, stád a gine ar a gunra. Ba chosúil go bégur síníomh an cunra gandal a góir leis hain ar dús is mú a bhí chuirtine séid. An cunra hain, an tunchar do haig ar wins na héidan, níor an méidin ach na dar na hearts.
It was an act of disloyalty to their president and to their colleagues in the cabinet, such as is probably without parallel in history. They not merely signed the document, but in order to make the fait accompli doubly secure, they published it hours before the president or their colleagues saw it.
Fuin Wajandar Gien is cínte gura an conra léite ag De Valera agus dúirt se le báil an réaltas a bhí fós im lá clia gura sé héin le cur an na chunne. Hasta bhaid chomá go gafií as an réaltas an Colánach, Barton agus an Grífach ar Ilerób. An enún impi ó na chóleacaithe chu sé a bhí hástacht an úl go peblií agus stailte sé ráitis.
In view of the nature of the proposed treaty with Great Britain, President De Valera has sent an urgent summons to the members of the Cabinet in London to report at once, so that a full Cabinet decision may be taken. The hour of the meeting is fixed for 12 o'clock noon tomorrow. A meeting of the Dáil will be summoned later.
It was really an infamous performance on the part of De Valera, as the leader of the nation that he was appealing to issue this letter at this time. For all practical purposes, it was tantamount to his meeting Griffith at the boat at Dunleary and slapping him publicly across the face.
Feiltíh cunílacha an chunra price na síchana an uchtán no maidne. Dóib siúd a reid ó gogan na sírse, iad siúd a bhí a lorg poblach na héiran, daine arnús arní ó Mali, ba deacar glacha leis.
Bhíos ag malach tú betrain. Bhair leis seo a bhí mar a trid, leis seo a chréach mar sin féin le linn an toscogaí. Nuair a hep an chéad arog sin, bhíos gan mothúir be. Tháinig tuirse mhór orm. Hí mé síos le heis an bhard. Bhí mé fí mar a bheith fearr a bheith a géirí a cheann a chosint ar bhuilí a bhí ag teacht ó gach taobhéir. Bhí mar gá ilan ar an mord, mar gá láb a gcuineh misisiní. Ní raibh ar mar chumas smaoineh. Déach mé ar an mala mar a rá léirscáil den chríochailt. Buin mé an úsé agus gramí méid an bhar dé, agus mé a féchant go dáir. Thusig crut ag teacht ar dom. Déanach cnic agus sléifte as na línta cóirde. Déanach cuilte as na pastí beag a glasa, agus ní na hauna in na línta gurma tríd na glauntaí. Seo í an tír gur chridimer ar a son. Lan mé na teornacha. Barací fullada, dúirte nó unsathe. Tríd an táin a lasa a bhí mar chórda ar. Haspáin siad chuna sa teománach an náid siar isteach ar a phríomhlínte cumarsáide. Circail chorama do bhluc hitheh Paulíní, Carnóga gurama do Bharací mílata, ar gumplachtaí beaga marcáide de peann Louis Jarg, Clive de Trasner a chéile in nuach corcra Indiach ar lorthacha inar Fridmid. Bhí star an cheantar os machóir. Lan mé ar gwiblinti beaga, ar muana, ar depina. Thiom ní mar sin féin don tír seo. Ganach an bás nó an prísún mar luach séhir dúin. Bhí an rud céine déanta ag grúnta ráin. Na marmh, cad a cheap siad san.
An aineoin buara locht chogó na sírse hí éfecht láireach dramatúil leis an gunra.
In view of the agreement signed yesterday between the representatives of the British government and the Irish delegation of plenipotentiaries, His Majesty has approved of the release forthwith of all persons now interned under Regulation 14B of the Restoration of Order in Ireland regulations. Instructions have been given accordingly.
Nuair a dark muidir an Ferógra, chuí runt farch ag an Cionfort, hasban siad an talta, agus déir siad go scílaí leithach lá. Lí sé leithach an gasla. Luí sé funse an álas a bhí aige, ach sé an fragra a fur sé nach ró aon álas an siúd agus ná ró siad chun ordaithe a ghlacam an Evening Telegraph. An sin, níos Jenny san ihe, hanig offigacht mílata leis an scéal go rómar le scilú séir. Lóir sé leis an dáchéad is céige prídeanach agus dúirt go síorfaí ar maidin sin, le gach aine lú áis. Farír bhí talán a thucail John Gistin, agus amsiú i caiiciis ribhi sin tar éis timpeall fiche slaat a bheith tóchailte. Cur gardas a kistin sin agus líú an talán. Ag bhímar ar fad le síú inis agus bachama mar galar sin.
Hug an Irish Independent Twedish get Ilya in the Duskury. They were accorded an enthusiastic send-off at Euston from hundreds of Irish people who had assembled on the platform. Mr. Collins came in for a lion's share of the demonstration. In the stampede, he lost his hat, but smilingly struggled to his carriage with the assistance of 12 police, who had all their work cut out for them in keeping back the cheering crowd. The crowd was so dense in the vicinity of the plenipotentiaries that the signal for the start had to be given from the bridge on the platform. The crowd renewed its cheering and sang a soldier's song as the train left the platform.
Bochta timpeall na nullag, ní rah aine in Isla Brí. Ba chumach ó bochta sa bhí tú, chairigh gach aine le na chéile. Na bochtáin, chuir rud ag an ar fáil a gcónaí dóibh. Mana raibh fuaic acu, chóthach duine ag an dóibh é. Jochad a chuineal nullag, chuineal jarrag a gcónaí, sa an asca ó a chiop a gróséire. Zach na fuineoga máisithe, péinteáilte agus péinteáilfaí duras an hala. Ní mór ná gur dá glas a bhí ar gach aon duras. Agus ins na fuineoga, chuir dhís cuileann agus ainán agus na curtnaí lá sa bán.
Le lindamh lá clia a bheith galbhú a gcóir na nulach, hí na toscarí agus an conra ar an mád poist ó Holyhead go dún léide. Dec hí an culánach a gcóra le bert de chuid fearr, Liam Tobin agus David Nelligan.
Tobin said, "We'll have to face our diehards now. The first time I'd heard the expression used in Irish politics. We were to hear it often enough afterwards." He thought the British government had surrendered to murder. High-ranking British military were nearly all Tory in politics and of course took their cue from General Macready. This officer, who had in his final reports to the British government stated that his troops were in the last stages of exhaustion, no doubt gave expression to bellicose remarks to his colleagues. The Major also thought that the Irish would be at one another's throats in a few months. I put this down to another English libel at the time. "If the treaty was not passed," he said, "we will flood the place with troops." This was mere bluff, because we knew they had not got them. The great majority of soldiers who had gone through the First War had left the army, being heartily sick of soldiering. In fact, it was a good job for the volunteers that they had to face only poor, young, raw conscripts, for that is what most of them were. After all, it was the rank and file who carried the can, as they say themselves.
Hastel ó grífa an culánach, Barton agus ó Duffy a gan na híche agus bhaineidir dún léide amach hartar is sé ar maidin. Bhí daoine ar an géad ón trío chlog a fannachlóg a faideach faoi gála an gíomhde chun fáilte rúpa. Chur bráidechas poblach na héireann fáilte ferimalta airim rih an grífach agus rih an culánach nuair a freitheadar dún léide.
Na hefiige agus na fear gur bhfuil mé lo, Saoliach dom grow marrow lorhu. We quid ac be queene, be a sula ata. Dan mynd gung aufri na Tuscary. Ni rav einu draws akushinu, gan an scale a harfi broad and realtish. Hele quidagrin gung aufri iad colures a hanad a deer, ach near harla dada. Hahan a gwyd umperlish na nuachtain. Per na corley kunte entus nu asentus an uel. Hebig an clear glahas catlicach chi chele lesh an shinu. Hio me na chaptery chuig na runain timpadorum, agus for me macro cade agus tri runan an deskert in aig an chunarha. Ach bro an cade runan irrach, trid is trid hev. Be dal erin as cusul kun disporach de yenaver na hartigal. Came fan nach river hummus an uchteroin, suckru a yenaver an guest.
Golua an wadin sin hannig teachtarach do Chuisleán lá clia gur a prísúnaí erim na poblachta le scuile sir an wadin sin. Bhí tionchor an chondra le fecal go soléir fud de tíre mar a tuairiscíh san Irish Independent. From an early hour a huge crowd gathered outside the grim walls of the prison, and at about 11 o'clock the front gates were thrown open and a deafening cheer was heard when it became known that the men were about to emerge. Burdened with bundles containing all their personal goods, they appeared at the entrance, and according as each man passed through, he was subjected to an ovation which became almost frantic in its enthusiasm. Numbers of men were seen to shake hands with the British officers standing at the gate, and the utmost good humour prevailed on both sides. The majority of the men who were incarcerated at Kilmainham were arrested at the Custom House or in its vicinity on the day on which the building was burned. It was ascertained that about 200 untried and uncharged prisoners were released. Anion Langara Ohish Lasmud just na Prisún, Bidrach Hori Flúsach. Kegur Fogus Lán Gardach le na Tuscary a London, the Analche Eresh go Hérin níos cúne, Cudwa níos cúne.
It was, in a sense, prophetic that there was no welcoming crowd and no signs of jubilation on reaching Dublin. Instead, the few people about seemed strangely apathetic. This lack of jubilation among the people was dispiriting enough, but it was nothing compared with the open hostility we faced in the cabinet drawing room of the Mansion House. De Valera was waiting there, looking gaunt and depressed, while Stack was in a blazing mood, and Brua was the personification of venom.
The cabinet meeting which immediately followed the delegation's return concentrated on the way in which the treaty had been signed without the cabinet's authority. It took Cosgrave's urgings for De Valera to agree to hear the delegation's account of what happened. Griffiths and Barton's arguments that they had only signed under conditions of extreme duress did not allay De Valera's, Stack's and Brewer's feelings that their trust had been abused.
Hossa an chóireacht lá fada tarsúil, clampur agus garán, agus lean an sra prísúnach na prísún na ágáil. Las mu dechir bhainean, thug muintir medlar agus claffi, Aila Córi Otjola, marcecht do bhaile an na firsíra, agus ug ban medlar adagófsúd a bhí fannacht warcecht.
Chuirmar orgarna agus ggóistí fad fáil don na firas agus Iománamar bhaile go dtí a dithe féin I maiile clia iad. Dul bhíh mis lón dóibhsúd a bhí ag fehéir doras. Bhí slú a gealgóireach, báú bagóile, saidúirí ag fearra ón Malcóin os cionn an gheata. An saidúir bhíh buinte an glascht an gheata, bhí sé sin níos dá riara, is dó go tuis gur cá sé obair go cruaigh an bhaidin sin.
I arrived to find De Valera head in hands reproaching Michael Collins for signing. De Valera was to speak at great length that day. He centred his opposition mainly on the fact that the delegates had not referred back to him before signing as Griffith had promised to do, claiming that he would have gone to London had it not been for Griffith's promise not to sign without referral back.
I told De Valera that the whole situation had arisen because of his vacillation. He'd had his chance of going to London and had refused. The disaster was that we were not a fighting delegation. there was much discussion as to whether or not the delegation had signed under duress. Collins said that the position was that in a contest between a great empire and a small nation, the settlement was as far as a small nation could go. Until the British Empire was destroyed, Ireland could get no more. On that basis only was he intimidated.
Jere is casgrave a hokra an scéal. Lótal sé leis an Gulánach, an Grífach agus Barton a nai brú de Stack agus de Valera. Hepe an dhearach an conra a joltú glán amach agus inis lococh an díspóireacht go dí an dáil. Ní rag de Valera áras duine cá has sé héin, agus an líchi sin dailte sé for ógra.
A Chárde Gael, you have seen in the public press the text of the proposed treaty with Great Britain. The terms of this agreement are in violent conflict with the wishes of the majority of this nation, as expressed freely in successive elections during the past 3 years. I feel it is my duty to inform you immediately that I cannot recommend the acceptance of this treaty, either to Dáil Éireann or the country. In this attitude, I am supported by the Ministers of Home Affairs and Defence. The great test of our people has come. Let us face it worthily, without bitterness, and above all, without recriminations.
Chui me go bailio clia, kun olimach cadévi tarlu, kun fisa all car hias and tarum. Chui me stacha me gilligans, mar benoslamaks me sa char. Ian Tailach, a Juan Eileen, the Vauber and Honoha. Be Ginger O'Connell, Canasi Kunta and Aramown. You're out here cheating hele. You should sauce the galore in a hele gwitine. When you shame on the border, the Casa a Heen, for your marbenoslesh or Gazadian of Green. Then Ashby Michael Brennan, Canpert on Head Ranon Irherig in a he. Be an Homa Erger Aintig she Fainax and Far Ella Gamalahele. Rivishin be Navlis at a Fainax Mulcahy or Collins. Somebody kinder an arm as a ginger. Big Cathergan 5 mile farvahan, bin an menu. Be a quid jacker the rate agru an aram and hest hovatach. Kunnas or broish shive, Ersemisha. On high ara session, Hasulagan Catlan Ma'a oil on Dararan on Deskrit Daraman Sirstoit. Fear of Raha the Countersa, near a Fukalasam. Kibet far of it to an hour hurt, session. Kai to trade him Countersa, ma hooking to drum let of yon, Ersemisha. Dimmy gan oira daig ginger. Shine an author by to Kuga Fiach for a Lorlach. And son, Dogus and Chumra.
Nar I bhí deire le himimeachtaí tábhachta an nachtú láid a bhíon an nolach sem líon 19 thug Michael Collins toras a hen chara Bet O'Connor.
Bhí é se chosúite I gimachtaí an le gur staidse licam doris taréistum oscailtá. Escinstum ina hasamh an son. Dirach aitir aig ní atain hiscins agus díomhréastá cad leis scúltú fanacht. Cheapas ná beach an áid Rome a bheit a dirach Collins. Dúras leis thug sé an conras seo is úntach an rudde. Teastíonn sé óna daoine caithfir a leib sean sa thuirtstóibh a dúirim a chruinúil An sin má héanann siad ach ní héanann siad Beg de chuid dianta a gutsa. Ní bheith éon reagaracht ort as na tarthaí. Well, chuir son súignas beagar Collins ach beagán sin ile. Bhí sé ró lán de dhiamra sa síos. Bhí sé sias sós an seomra céanna inar ITS dul go London sa chéadáid. Caithfh láb san agus ag bagart beag clia a ágans agus file a chorcaí dá mófaí an gonra. Má hasannaíon na hiile truda a sesin. Troidig me go hoscailte le heis mo winter a féin ó yes. Ní bheith me I mo hóíocht agus ma hethe timppel bhaile clia faoi mar a bhíos le há líon anis.
Tar éis díosbóireacht adas a dáil, foiimhú an conra an 16 láid a bhí ainir sem líon 1952. Mí agus lá tar éis don na toscarí híniú is ráid Downing. Bhua sé le 60 go bhóta in 1957. Caibhlinn te lean fanna gianta, chríochna sé le linn 3 lá a mína nolach, 3 bhíhín, 1 físa a bháin popé. Is iad achtarí ciniúnacha an 3 láisiún agus an conra a féimhú dá láin, a bhraithach tauchaí an náisiún agus ciniúnt na bhean a híine
Bad dreams, hopeless nightmares. You find yourself in London streets, cold and dank in the night air. Think, what have I got for Ireland? Something which she has wanted these past 700 years. Will anyone be satisfied at the bargain? Will anyone? I tell you this, early this morning, I signed my death warrant.
Scéal trágóid a cháirn mór atá fa chabdil an seir TG Card a céan se hagan ag leabharéis sinnaí fós an se nacht glóir tíre.